In one of the largest automotive companies in the world, there sat a man everyone simply called the GM, the general manager of the engine division. Years of experience, hundreds of successful projects, and a reputation built through sheer sweat and discipline. But beneath all that success lay a secret few people knew. He was afraid to build a new engine, not out of laziness and not out of incompetence, but out of a deeper fear rooted in the past, a fear that resurfaced every time a new project was mentioned, pulling him into silence. For weeks, the engineering team had been preparing early designs. Charts covered the walls, calculations were precise, and there was a big dream for an engine that could reshape the future of the industry. But every time the file landed on the GM's desk, he pushed it aside and said the same thing: "It's not the right time yet." The story of this fear went back 10 years. Back then, a younger, more passionate GM had been in charge of building a revolutionary engine, a project meant to carve his name into the history of the industry. He and his team worked day and night. A massive budget was spent, and everything was ready for the big unveiling. But on the day of the final test, disaster struck. The engine failed mid-test, caught fire, and not only caused millions of dollars in damage, but seriously injured a young engineer on the team. That day, something inside the GM broke. The man who had always moved forward with total confidence tasted real failure for the first time. A failure that wasn't just professional, but deeply human. After the accident, the GM withdrew into isolation for months. Board meetings, blame, and the heavy stares of colleagues all pushed them toward one belief: it was safer never to take a risk again. He learned that playing it safe was better than losing big. From then on, any project that resembled that catastrophic engine, even slightly, was reviewed with obsessive caution and usually shut down in its earliest stages. Years passed. The GM became a leader known for executing small projects flawlessly, but he never let anyone chase a big dream again. He built a reputation as a cautious, dependable man, but deep down he knew something had been lost, the very boldness that once made him exceptional. Now, 10 years later, a new team of young engineers full of energy and big dreams had joined the company. Among them was a woman named Sarah, sharp, determined, and the mind behind a completely new engine design. Lighter, more powerful, and more efficient than anything built before. Sarah and her team had spent weeks refining this design. They knew this project could put the company ahead of every competitor, but to move forward, they needed final approval from the GM, a man known across the entire industry for his caution. The day of the presentation arrived. Sarah walked into the meeting room with confidence. She projected charts, walked through the calculations, and spoke passionately about the engine's potential. The GM listened in silence, but his eyes told a different story: fear, hesitation, and memories that had never truly faded. When Sarah finished, the GM sat quietly for a long moment. Then, in a calm but firm voice, he said, "It's a good design, but the risk is too high. It needs further review." It was a sentence Sarah had heard from other managers before, a sentence that usually meant no. Sarah wasn't discouraged. She sensed something deeper behind his hesitation. She began digging into the GM's past and soon uncovered the story of that accident from 10 years earlier. Suddenly, everything made sense. The GM wasn't afraid of her project. He was terrified of reliving an old nightmare. Sarah decided to change her approach. Instead of pushing for a quick approval, she requested a private meeting with the GM, not to defend the project, but to talk honestly about his real concerns. In that private meeting, Sarah said gently, "I know what happened 10 years ago, and I know that memory is still with you." The GM froze for a moment. No one had dared to speak to him directly about that accident in years. He let out a long breath and said, "That day, I didn't just lose a project. I lost my confidence. A young engineer was hurt because of my decision. How can I ever take a risk like that again?" For the first time in years, his voice carried a tremor of genuine honesty. Sarah replied calmly, "You're right to be cautious, but what's the difference between caution and paralysis? Caution means managing risk, not running from it. She then explained that unlike the previous project, her team had built in multiple layers of safety and the gradual step-by-step testing process, designed specifically to prevent a repeat of that catastrophe. The GM slowly flipped through the design pages again, this time not with fear, but with curiosity. He realized Sarah wasn't just a talented engineer. She was someone who had studied the past and built its lessons directly into her design. Still, the decision wasn't easy. At night, the GM lay awake replaying the past, the sound of the explosion, the shouts of his colleagues, the face of that young engineer in the hospital bed. It was all still vivid in his mind. But alongside those painful memories, another image began to form. The image of a young man who once dreamed of transforming an entire industry. He thought to himself, if I run from risk forever, what's left of that young GM I used to be? The question lodged itself in his mind like a splinter, forcing him into deeper reflection. The next day, the GM decided to take a different path. Instead of a quick rejection or approval, he asked to personally join the design and testing process. The decision stunned everyone. A man who had stayed out of hands-on work for years now wanted to roll up his sleeves again. He told Sarah, "I want to see this project up close, not as an observer, but as someone working alongside you." Sarah accepted with surprise and delight. It was the beginning of a collaboration no one had expected. Weeks passed. The GM and Sarah's team spent hours together in the lab. The GM shared his experience, explained past mistakes, and helped the team identify potential weak points in the design. In return, the energy and creativity of the younger engineers reignited something in him that had gone dark for years. For the first time in a decade, the GM felt the thrill of working on something big again. Fear still lingered in a corner of his mind, but it no longer paralyzed him. The day of the final test arrived. This time, unlike 10 years before, everything had been checked with obsessive precision. Multiple safety layers had been installed. Advanced sensors monitored the engine's condition in real time, and a team of specialists stood ready at a safe distance for any emergency. The GM's heart pounded harder than ever. Memories of that catastrophic day weighed on his mind like a shadow. But this time, Sarah stood beside him, her confidence offering him a strange kind of calm. The moment arrived. The start button was pressed. The roar of the engine filled the hall. Everyone held their breath. Seconds felt like hours. The GM closed his eyes, bracing for the worst. But this time, nothing went wrong. The engine came to life smoothly, powerfully, beyond anyone's expectations. The numbers on the screen showed performance far exceeding projections. The room fell into complete silence until one of the engineers shouted, "We did it!" Tears and applause filled the hall. Sarah looked at the GM with tears in her eyes. This was a man who had lived under the shadow of fear for years, now witnessing the birth of something that could change the company's future forever. The GM stood still for a moment, staring at the engine glowing before him. It was no longer just a machine. It was a symbol of overcoming fear, of returning to his own roots, and of the truth that sometimes the biggest obstacles aren't out in the world, but inside our own minds. In the weeks that followed, news of this new engine's success spread across the entire industry. Competitors were stunned. Media outlets spoke of a revolution in engine design, and the company was once again recognized as an industry leader in innovation. But for the GM, the real achievement was something else entirely. He had become, once again, a man with the courage to dream, not recklessly, but with the wisdom earned from the past. He understood now that failure isn't the end of the road. It can be the beginning of a deeper, more thoughtful journey. At the official unveiling of the new engine, the GM stood behind the podium. A crowd of engineers, journalists, and senior executives watched him closely. He glanced at Sarah and her team, then turned to the audience and said, 10 years ago, I lost something I thought I would never find again, my courage. Today, thanks to a young team that reminded me who I used to be, I found it. Fear will always be with us, but it's up to us to decide whether we let it stop us. The applause shook the room. The GM smiled, a smile no one had seen from him in years. He was no longer a man afraid to build. He had become a man who had learned how to build with his fear.